There are screams that never fade, carried not through the air, but through the marrow of a bloodline. In the hollow of Kentucky's mountains, where fog swallows cabins whole, and the soil is dark with forgotten burials, there exists a family whose history was written in the language of rot. Old men in town used to whisper about their cries, thin, high-pitched wails that echoed at midnight from behind boarded windows, as if children were being born only to die before their lungs had learned the rhythm of breath. No one dared walk close, but everyone heard. It begins not with love, but with a photograph. A bride standing too close to her groom, her smile brittle, her eyes wide in a way that suggests she knew what the camera could not confess. Her white lace veil hid nothing. Her groom's face was her own face, reshaped into the hard jaw of a man. Brother and sister, husband and wife. A union so wrong it seemed carved from blasphemy itself. The locals who once caught glimpses said their wedding did not look like a celebration. It looked like a funeral disguised in flowers. But the story did not begin there. That marriage was only the culmination. The last desperate note in a hymn sung for nearly a century by a family determined to fold in on itself. Their patriarch had once declared that strangers diluted the blood. That weakness came from opening doors to outsiders. Purity, he said, was found only within their own veins. And so, each generation turned inward, seeking brides and grooms among sisters, cousins, daughters, until even their faces began to echo one another too perfectly, like mirrors warped by time. The air around their cabin never felt right. Hunters swore they saw symbols scratched into the bark of trees. Crude carvings of circles crossed with lines, like warnings meant for anyone who strayed too close. Sometimes livestock went missing, and when the carcasses were found, bones were broken in patterns too deliberate to be the work of animals. Dogs refused to approach their property. Horses reared at the smell. And yet, the family thrived in its own diseased way, building generation upon generation, convinced that their suffering was sacred. If you are still listening, lean closer for just a moment. Which city are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Because when the truth of this family finally surfaced, it was already too late. Too late for the children, whose bodies never fit their own bones. Too late for the mothers whose wombs had been used as laboratories. And far too late for the young bride in that photograph, who would spend her life locked in the prison her ancestors built long before she drew her first breath. To understand the decay of this family, you must first understand the land that hid them. Eastern Kentucky in the mid-1800s was less a community than a wilderness. Mountains folded over one another like clenched fists. Hollows so deep that the sun vanished by afternoon, and trails that ended in nothing but silence. Maps of that era often left wide blank spaces where the Bramwells lived, as if cartographers themselves sensed that nothing holy should be recorded there. The county seat sat 20 miles away, but distance in the mountains was measured not in miles, but in days. It was a place where neighbors might go years without speaking, where families clung to their own soil with suspicion, and where rumors became scripture. The Bramwells built their cabin in one of these forgotten folds, half swallowed by trees older than memory. Their land was damp, the creek behind their house running black with silt and coal dust. In winter, the wind screamed through the chinks in the logs. In summer, the air hung so heavy that sweat turned to mildew. And always, there was the smell, damp earth, smoke, and something faintly metallic, like blood rusting in the air. The first of them, Jeremiah Bramwell, had not come here by accident. He was already carrying whispers when he arrived in 1847. whispers of things done in Virginia that had made him unwelcome. He brought with him a sister, who was also a wife, and a conviction that what the world called sin, he would call purity. Together, they began the ritual of self-destruction, binding blood to blood until their children carried more resemblance than health. It is said that when the first child, Ezekiel, learned to walk, he walked in circles, never straight. His speech came slow, thick as though the words themselves resisted leaving his mouth. Still, Jeremiah called him blessed. Still, he told neighbors the boy was chosen. And when more children came, each more fragile than the last, Jeremiah only doubled down. He carved his sermons into his family's skin. Outsiders corrupt, insiders sanctify. By the 1870s, the Bramwells had become a presence in Pike County, though not a welcome one. Miners and farmers alike avoided their holler, claiming they had seen children with 2 large heads and 2 small bodies peering from the windows. Midwives refused to enter their cabin, so births happened alone, in the shadow of oil lamps and the stench of iron. Some babies lived, some died, but all carried the mark of Jeremiah's obsession. The church in town knew. Preachers whispered. Elders turned their heads. And yet no one acted, because the Bramwells rarely left their hollow. They buried their dead in a crooked cemetery behind the cabin, stones carved with the same last name over and over. Each one closer to the last, like a chant whispered into stone. And from that soil, from those graves, something new began to grow. A child who would not only inherit the curse, but shape it into something darker. The child was born on a night when the sky itself seemed to split. Thunder cracked against the mountains, rolling like cannons across the hollers, and rain poured so violently that the creek behind the Bramwell cabin swelled until it clawed at the edges of the graveyard. Inside, by the light of a single lamp, Charity Bramwell delivered her son. His father was her brother, Ezekiel, fulfilling the pact set by their father Jeremiah before his death. The boy's name was Morai. From the moment he opened his eyes, the family sensed something different. Unlike his cousins, who struggled to breathe or walk, Morai was alert, too alert, his gaze fixed on objects far longer than it should have. By 3, he could read the tattered Bible his grandfather had left behind. By 5, he calculated sums in the dirt with a sharp stick. By 10, he asked questions that no child should have known to ask. What if the blood grows stronger the closer it is kept? What if the sickness of some is the gift of another? Neighbors who glimpsed him described a child too quiet, too measured, watching with an intensity that unsettled grown men. Animals avoided him. Dogs snarled when he passed. Some claimed birds fell silent when he entered a clearing. Charity told herself her son was blessed, that he was the proof Jeremiah's vision had not been in vain. But others whispered that Morai was not simply a child. He was a vessel, carrying the weight of every sin pressed into the family's veins. As he grew, his intelligence deepened, but so did his detachment. He watched his siblings suffer, twisted spines, gasping lungs, seizures that turned nights into screams, and he did not weep. Instead, he recorded. He kept lists scratched into the margins of old hymnals, date of birth, defect, age of death. He studied his own family as though they were specimens in an experiment, and in a way, that was exactly what they had become. When neighbors asked about the strange noises from the hollow, children crying, wood splitting, prayers turning into guttural moans, Morai himself would sometimes appear at the edge of the road, polite, composed, his answers never more than a few words. But his eyes unsettled them, eyes that seemed too old for his face, as if he were only borrowing the body of a boy, while something older and colder looked out. By 17, Morai had become the patriarch. His father Ezekiel's mind had unraveled, leaving him a husk muttering prayers to a god who had long since turned away. His mother, Charity, was weak, her body wasted by repeated births and burials. It was Morai who gave orders now. Morai who arranged marriages. Morai who determined which children would be paired, as if he were arranging livestock, breeding for traits no outsider would ever understand. And soon, his obsession would turn upon his own sister. Her name was Temperance. She had been born small and frail, her bones seeming almost translucent beneath her skin. But she survived where others did not. From the time she could walk, Morai told her she was chosen. He read to her from the journals he kept. Pages of numbers, diagrams of family pairings, legible formulas that he called the key to transcendence. Temperance listened, because she had been taught, from birth, that obedience was survival. By the time she turned 13, the holler already whispered her fate. There would be no husband from town, no stranger from the valley. Her brother would claim her, and she would not be permitted to refuse. When the day came, there was no ceremony, no blessing. Only Morai, with his quiet voice and his cold touch, declaring her his wife as though he were conducting an experiment rather than a union. Neighbors claimed they heard her cries in the night, muffled, quickly silenced. Others said she was never seen outside the cabin again without Morai at her side, her face pale, her eyes downcast. The family graveyard grew fuller in those years, small headstones rising like weeds. Children who lived hours, days, sometimes months before the defects consumed them. Yet Morai did not mourn, he catalogued. He whispered to Temperance that each failure brought them closer to perfection. It was during these years that strange signs began to appear in the woods. Hunters found bones arranged in careful spirals, ribs stacked like spokes of a wheel, skulls balanced in trees where the wind could whistle through their hollow sockets. No one admitted to going near the Bramwell land at night, but stories spread of lights moving between the trees, of chanting so low it seemed to rumble from the earth itself. Inside the cabin, Temperance bore 7 children. 3 never drew breath beyond their first day. 2 survived, but their bodies were twisted, their minds unreachable. Morai kept them hidden, calling them failed vessels. But 2 remained. The first was Thomas, born strong, with broad shoulders and steady hands. The second was Sarah May, a girl of uncanny beauty, her eyes deep and unblinking, her smile too serene for a child. Morai saw in them the proof of his design. He watched as they grew, documenting every word they spoke, every gesture they made, as though their lives were entries in his ledger. They were not raised as children. They were raised as continuations of a theory, pawns in a game that had begun with Jeremiah and would end only when Morai declared it complete. And from the moment Sarah May was old enough to walk, Morai whispered her destiny into her ear. She was to belong to Thomas. She was to carry his children. She was to be the vessel through which the family's bloodline would finally ascend. The children never knew a world outside those walls. They never knew freedom. They never knew choice. Thomas grew into a man whose strength carried no warmth. His body was capable, his face symmetrical, but his eyes were hollow, like windows into a house with no light inside. He worked the land without complaint, chopping wood, tending meager crops, digging graves for the infants who came and went. Yet when he looked at Sarah May, his gaze did not hold the softness of a brother, nor the desire of a man. It was colder than both. He saw her as a duty, a possession predetermined long before either of them were born. Sarah May, in contrast, bloomed like something fragile forced to grow in darkness. Her beauty unsettled those few outsiders who glimpsed her. Neighbors whispered she had the look of a ghost, pale and ethereal, as though she did not fully belong to this world. Her hair shone like black water in the lamplight. Her eyes seemed too deep for her face, as though they carried centuries of sorrow that did not belong to a young woman. But within her, something had been broken early. Every thought of independence had been smothered by Morai's whispers, by his careful reminders that her body was not her own. It was the family's. By the time she reached 23, Sarah May had never spoken to a man outside her bloodline, never walked further than the crooked fence that marked the edge of Bramwell land, never allowed herself to imagine a world beyond the trees that hemmed her in like prison bars. She existed as a shadow, waiting for the day her father's command would become reality. That day came in the spring of 1921. The mountains were still thawing, snow melting into black mud, when Morai declared the time had come. A preacher from the next valley was summoned, bribed into silence with coin and liquor. The guest list was small, fewer than 20 souls, all of them Bramwells, all carrying the same hollow look, the same resigned obedience. Sarah May wore her mother's altered wedding dress, yellowed with age. Her bouquet was mountain laurel picked from the same hillside, where generations of Bramwell brides had gathered flowers, each one stepping deeper into the family's curse. Thomas stood at the makeshift altar inside the cabin, his suit hanging loose on his frame, his hands steady, but his face empty. The preacher spoke the words, careful to avoid mention of the blood between them. Papers were signed, photographs were taken, and just like that, Sarah May Bramwell became Sarah May Bramwell. The name unchanged, the prison unbroken. That night, the holler fell silent. Neighbors said not even the frogs croaked, not even the owls called. It was as though the earth itself recoiled from what had just been bound together. And inside the cabin, on sheets already worn thin from decades of use, the cycle began again. Sarah May's body was not her own. It belonged to the bloodline, to her brother, to her father's ledger, and within months, she carried the first child of their union. Sarah May's pregnancy was not her own miracle. It was Morai's triumph. He measured her stomach's growth with string, noted her sickness in margins of his journal, and timed her labor pains against the tick of a broken pocket watch. To him, the child inside her was not a son or daughter. It was data, proof of whether his generations of cruelty had borne fruit. When the child came, the family gathered in the cabin like parishioners in a church. No doctor was summoned. No midwife dared to cross the hollow. It was only Sarah May's muffled cries, Thomas's steady silence, and Morai's relentless recording as the baby fought its way into the world. The infant was a boy. He screamed with lungs full and strong, his cry piercing enough to rattle the cabin's warped boards. For the first time in years, Morai smiled, not warmly, but with grim satisfaction. "He is whole," he said, raising the newborn as though he were presenting him to the ghosts buried on the hill. "He is the vessel." They named him Elijah. Elijah was not raised with love. He was raised with expectation. From his earliest memory, he was told his purpose. He was the continuation of the line, the one who would bring the Bramwells closer to perfection. Sarah May, broken and obedient, nursed him and clothed him, but she was never allowed to call him hers. He belonged to Morai. He belonged to the blood. As Elijah grew, strange things were noticed. He rarely cried, rarely laughed. At 3, he repeated back entire passages from Morai's journals after hearing them only once. At 5, he could walk silently through the woods, so quietly that even deer did not notice his approach. His eyes unsettled everyone, pale unblinking, as though he were forever watching something just beyond the edge of the visible world. And yet, there was sickness too. His hands sometimes trembled uncontrollably. His legs locked at night in spasms that left him crawling across the floor. His speech would vanish without reason, leaving him mute for weeks at a time. But Morai did not call these defects. He called them refinements. Each imperfection, he said, was a step toward the greater design. By the time Elijah turned 10, the Bramwell graveyard had doubled in size. More infants, more failed experiments, more stones carved by Thomas's hands. But Elijah remained alive. Elijah remained strong enough. And so Morai set his gaze upon him with a hunger that frightened even those too broken to resist. Because to Morai, Elijah was not just the continuation of the bloodline. He was the culmination. And with him, the cycle would be forced deeper, darker than it had ever gone before. Elijah Bramwell did not grow into the savior his grandfather had envisioned. He grew into something else, something that frightened even those who had lived their entire lives in silence and submission. By 16, his mind had outpaced everyone in the cabin. He no longer copied Morai's journals. He rewrote them, adding his own symbols, his own equations, scratched into the walls with charcoal, diagrams of family pairings that stretched back to the founding of the Hollow. Sarah May, his mother and his aunt, watched in silence as her son's gaze turned toward her the way Morai's once had. She knew the pattern. She knew the cycle. And when Elijah told her, in a voice that did not tremble, that she would bear him children, she did not scream. She simply lowered her eyes, because in the Bramwell Hollow, resistance had never been an option. The neighbors, those few who still dared to pass near the old fence line, spoke of screams rising into the night, and of a light in the cabin that never seemed to go out, as though the family had found a way to keep fire burning without wood. Others said they saw figures moving through the woods at dusk, shapes too tall, too thin, walking with unnatural stillness. No one dared go closer. Over the next decade, more graves filled the hillside, infants who lived for hours, days, sometimes years before sickness devoured them. And yet, through it all, Elijah remained, cold, calculating, convinced he was shepherding the family towards some terrible perfection. He became both patriarch and prophet, preaching not to a congregation but to the broken remnants of his own blood. By the 1940s, the Bramwells had all but vanished from county records. The cabin rotted into the hillside, the roof sinking, the windows dark. Hunters avoided the place, children dared one another to run past it, and county officials quietly struck the name from maps. The Hollow was abandoned, or so people believed. But even in silence, stories leaked out. A girl with pale eyes wandering into town at dawn, barefoot and filthy, only to vanish before anyone could stop her. Bones found in the woods, stripped too clean for animals to have done it. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, a voice carried across the mountains, low, steady, chanting words no outsider could understand. No one knows exactly when the Bramwells ended. Some say fire consumed the cabin in the 1950s. The flames rising so high they could be seen for miles. Others claim the family retreated underground, into caves carved into the hillside, where their descendants still whisper and wait. A few insist the bloodline never ended at all, that Elijah's seed spread quietly, hidden in nearby towns, carried by children who do not know what they are. What is certain is this: the graveyard still remains. Tilted stones, half swallowed by moss, marked only with initials and dates that make no sense. Locals say if you stand there long enough, the woods will grow unnaturally still, and you'll feel eyes on you, eyes that never blink, never look away. And somewhere, deep beneath the soil of Kentucky's shadowed hollows, the Bramwell curse still stirs. Waiting, watching, patient as the earth itself.